This is a re-recording of a very short presentation which I made to a Cockburn Association conference in Edinburgh in October 2024. I was asked to give an introduction to responsible tourism and over-tourism in the context of Edinburgh. It was quite a short presentation. This is recorded at somewhat greater length for the sake of completeness. The question I was asked to address was whether Edinburgh has an over-tourism problem. And the truth is that's not a simple question. Different residents will have different views. Tourists will have a diversity of views. Some people gain, others lose. Many gain and lose. So it's about the balance of views. And there's clearly a spatial dimension. Parts of the city may well be, in some people's eyes, experiencing over-tourism. Others will be regretting that they don't see tourists. Others will be pleased that they don't. There's also, I think, a temporal ratchet effect over the years and seasons. I first came to Edinburgh, I think, 35, 40 years ago. It was a very different city. I have memories of it as it was then. And my view of it now is in part based on the changes since I first visited, and that will be true for everyone. The graph on the left is actually a very early piece of work by Doxy, often called the Iridex, the irritation index. And I think this was a brave attempt to understand what was likely to happen, going from positive to negative feelings, starting with euphoria, then apathy, then irritation, and finally antagonism. The problem with it as a model, as far as I'm concerned, is it suggests that the whole community goes through that process at the same pace and at the same time. And on the face of it, that's unlikely. Different groups will experience that trajectory. Others will experience something completely different. And of course, they won't all go through that experience and that trajectory at the same time. I am not going to make the mistake of expressing an opinion about whether or not Edinburgh has an over-tourism problem. I may have a personal view, but it is purely a personal view. I can't have a professional view because I haven't been able to analyse the situation in any depth. I wanted to go back and just remind us of a campaign that Tourism Concern ran Our Holidays in Their Homes. Basically, we take our holidays in somebody else's home, and you can see in the top right there the response in Barcelona from the residents of Barceloneta, which is the old fisherman's village on the edge of the harbour. That sense that the tourists were invading their place for rest and recuperation. There's a lot of language used, different languages used. I'm never a tourist. I may be a visitor. I may be a guest, but I never see myself as strictly a tourist. I'd prefer to be seen as a traveller. Certainly wouldn't want to be called a day tripper or a grockle or emmet, which is language used in the West Country. The language used by Verlene Smith in a very important social anthropological study of tourism tried to use the language of hosts and guests, which implies particular kinds of behaviour both by the local residents and by the tourists. Whilst I aspire to that, I don't think it happens very often. And then, of course, you've got the problem of second homeowners, and as we do in Faversham, where I live, incomers and DFLs down from London people. The image there from Visit Ludlow is striking, I think, because it suggests that it is possible to invite visitors and treat them as temporary residents. But of course, if they're temporary residents, there's the implication that they might be expected to make a contribution to the maintenance of the place. So where did responsible tourism come from? Basically, it comes from the work of Jos Krippendorf in a very important seminal text, I would argue, The Holidaymakers, published in English in 1987, in which he called for rebellious tourists and rebellious locals. And he pointed out is that tourism is what we, consumers and producers, make it. We can change it. But the concerns about over-tourism go back at least to 1996 with Wasran's book on coping with tourism, European Reactions to Mass Tourism. It's not a new phenomenon. Responsible tourism itself came out of a side event held alongside the World Summit on Sustainable Development in 2002. By then, it was becoming increasingly obvious that only lip service was being paid to the idea of sustainability. And with Western Cape Province and the Responsible Tourism Partnership, we organised a conference in Cape Town alongside the WSSD to look at responsible tourism in destinations. That led to the Cape Town Declaration. And then 2 decades later, we revised that declaration in the light of 2 decades of experience, published the Responsible Tourism Charter, which we launched on Magna Carta Island in London. And now in 2024, we're launching the ICRT Global, which is designed to share experience around the world of how people have taken responsibility and made tourism better. The problem is that responsible tourism is the opposite of it, is over-tourism. And the problem is this: sustainability is only an aspiration, can only be realized if people take responsibility to make it happen. So responsibility essentially drives sustainability, and it's about making better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit. It's surprising how often people get that the wrong way round. It's a kind of litmus test for whether they've understood. But responsible tourism is about putting local people first and recognizing that great places to live are great places to visit, but they first of all have to be great places to live. And the converse of responsible tourism is irresponsible tourism, and that's what leads to over-tourism, where over-tourism occurs. So over-tourism, I think, is best understood as describing destinations where hosts or guests, locals or visitors, feel that there are too many visitors and that the quality of life in the area or the quality of the experience has deteriorated unacceptably. The place has been spoiled by tourism. And partly this is a consequence of the tragedy of the commons, because over-tourism happens when individuals seeking to maximize their own individual benefit damage the collective resource, the destination, people's home place, the place where people live, by exceeding the carrying capacity of the resource. Now, the language of the tragedy of the commons comes from overgrazing, but of course destinations are similar in a way to a grazed field, in the sense that they are open access resources. They're commons. Except when you think about it, they're not like fields, are they? Because fields, the farmer who controls a field controls the number of cattle permitted to graze upon that field. We're talking here about common land where there is no realistic control over the number of animals which may be placed there or find their way there in pursuit of food, resulting in overgrazing and ultimately in barren earth, which you see all too often in parts of Africa. Sir Colin Marshall, then chairman of British Airways, launched the Tourism for Tomorrow Awards in 1994. In a way, he let the cat out of the bag. This is a direct quote from the press release. Tourism and the travel industry, he said, is essentially the renting out for short-term lets of other people's environments. He goes on to talk about them. The bit that's often quoted is the latter sentence. These products must be kept fresh and unsullied, not just for the next day, but for every tomorrow. Well, quite true. But the problem is that there's nothing to stop more and more people wanting to use that place, that environment, that city square, that park, that national park for tourism, to bring tourists there. And nowhere has an infinite capacity. And of course, an additional problem is that the specific behaviours of the tourists can also affect that capacity. So first of all, the common destination is not infinite in its capacity. And secondly, different kinds of tourist behaviour can cause greater or lesser damage and more or less conflict with other users of the space, including the local population. So Gareth Hardin probably wrote the most widely read account of the problem of the tragedy of the commons. And he put it like this: each man or woman is locked into a system that compels him to increase his herd without limit. Tour operators want to sell as many trips as they can. Guides want to provide services for many tourists as possible. But they're doing this in a world that is limited. And therefore ruin is the destination towards which all men rush, each pursuing his own best interest in a society that believes in the freedom of the commons. There's a direct conflict with individual rational self-interest in having access to and using the resource, and the collective interest in ensuring that that product is kept fresh and unsullied for the next day and for every tomorrow. There is inevitably conflict in these relationships. So fundamentally, the question then, if we go back to the farmer and the gate on the field, is who does the place belong to and who is the place for? And here I think it's quite useful to think of private spaces and public spaces. Private spaces can have entrance fees, time tickets. Hotels, you have to book your room, and when the hotel is full, the hostel is full, the place is full. You can then, of course, look for private accommodation, maybe a B&B, maybe a short-term rental, which might be being used by tourists or by students at different times of the year. And then, of course, there's the issue of where's the revenue banked, taxed and spent. And of course, many short-term lets are banked in the owner's bank account, which may or may not be in Edinburgh, and it may or may not be taxed in the UK if it's owned by somebody abroad. And certainly the money will be spent most likely where the owner of that property resides. So that's the private spaces. The public spaces are more difficult. They're controlled by elected councils. They service the needs of the public, both residents and people who treat perhaps Edinburgh as an important part of their monthly life, but they don't live in the city, but they use it a lot. Then you've got NGOs and public spaces. And of course, you've got businesses which are owned by people living in the destination, but also owned by outsiders. And those public spaces are very, very difficult to regulate and control. So, the question of who a place belongs to is essentially a small p political question. And when conflict arises, it can very quickly become a large P political question, a matter for political debate in the city government or sometimes in the regional or national government. One of the ways of raising the issue with elected members and with officers that I found particularly useful is to ask the question, should tourism be allowed to use your place, this place, or should the destination use tourism for the sustainable development of the communities whose home it is? Clearly, this is a question which only governments can decide. Communities can have views about it, but in the end, it is the elected governments who will decide the answer to the question. Which kind of brings us to the question of how can tourism benefit a place? Well, the benefits are many. It brings additional spending power, brings employment, can grow businesses and tax revenues, can provide additional funding for museums, for heritage, for festivals in the public realm. It can also reduce out-migration from rural areas. These are all economic and social goods. But there are costs. The most obvious one, and the one that seems to give rise most frequently to major conflicts about overtourism, is the impact on housing costs and the availability of housing. But there's also littering and trampling, congestion and crowding, and there are the induced effects with migration, second homes, holiday lets and retirees. There are parts of the UK where incoming retirees who've come to enjoy the place that they used to come on holiday to, where they are resented because they're coming as retirees, making a bigger demand on the health service than the local population. And perhaps of less importance, but nonetheless significant to many people, is the changes in the retail offer that can happen as bakers and butchers get replaced by tourist shops selling goods clearly primarily intended for purchase by tourists. So tourism can benefit places, but it can also change places and impose costs on the local community. Now, we often hear talk about carrying capacity, and that works quite well with standard forms of activity like grazing or the carrying capacity of a tube train. You can calculate that fairly carefully for transport systems. But it gets a lot more complicated when you start talking about people. And that's reflected in the range of carrying capacity methodologies that there are. My own view is that the literature around limits of acceptable change is more useful in the sense that you can define things which, if you like, are trigger points that demonstrate that you pass the acceptable point in terms of the impact of tourism, but you're still left with a major problem about how you enforce controls over access to what are public spaces, to commons. The issue is generally about management. It's about controlling access, it's about parking, it's about site management and hardening. It's about sacrifice zones, to use national park language. It's about the management of the revenue. These are difficult and intractable problems, and if you're talking about public space, the public realm, then controlling access is much more difficult, if not impossible, by comparison with what you can do with a private space where you can ticket and gate admission. This leads on to the question of who manages the destination. Whose responsibility is it to prevent a place getting spoiled? The advertisement from Cricketer Holidays there, which is actually a good company, they placed it in Gardens Illustrated, and that's where I found it. It was only there the 1 month. We're unfortunate that I happened across it. But it was a good advert. Whenever a place gets spoiled, we move on. And they're only telling the truth. But of course, it is quite revealing the way in which tour operators tend to deal with places which become spoiled by tourism. One of the problems is what the word M means in DMO. For too many and for too long, the M referred merely to marketing. And most places, of course, have multiple meanings and multiple images for both residents and visitors. And the marketing organisation often presents the dominant image of the place, but they don't have a monopoly of that. And of course, by marketing, we generally mean promotion. And that simply brings you more tourists. It doesn't necessarily give you control over who you attract, but it could do that. Demarketing can play an important role, and we've seen that in Amsterdam in particular, where carefully targeted demarketing has reduced the number of hen and stag parties going to Amsterdam, with desirable effects for the local community. The other meaning of the word M, or the other use, is management. But of course, to manage a destination requires a whole of government approach. It's about transport and roads, it's about land use and planning, it's about housing policy and the regulation of who and how can rent out flats and short-term rentals to tourists and to students, for that matter. And generally, the regulatory opportunities are determined by national legislation, not by the city. They can only use the powers given to them by central government. And arrivals at the port, the airport, the roads and rail are not under their control. They are normally controlled by national government or national authorities. So it's very difficult to control arrivals in a destination. So what do? Well, I think you have to create partnerships and you have to collaborate together, recognizing that the competition for Edinburgh is other destinations. Now, Edinburgh performs extremely well in that competition, and it does that in part because there's a significant amount of cooperation between the various parts of the industry. But the choice of target markets made by the destination marketers has real consequences for the existing businesses. And whose right is it to decide what the image of a destination should be, about how that destination, that city, should be presented to the outside world, and who should be attracted to visit? On the other hand, destinations do choice edit for visitors by what they offer and what they don't offer. So there are opportunities to use a destination management organization to choice edit. But if you've got existing businesses that don't fit with the profiling of the kind of visitors you want to attract, then inevitably you have a political and regulatory issue to resolve. One of the things I think is really important to remember is that the key performance indicators that you give to the marketers and managers for volume, yield, or quality of life will make a difference to the way that they manage and market the destination. And in that sense, you can begin to think about what benefits residents get from tourism and which residents are getting those benefits, and then adjust the way you manage the destination to meet those needs. So, to come back to the core question, is Edinburgh suffering from overtourism? I don't know, in the sense that I'm not going to give a personal opinion, and I haven't had the opportunity to do any research here to determine whether it is or not. However, it is clear that some people feel that it is, and they're vocal. So those issues need to be addressed. The issues are multiple. As I said at the beginning, there are different issues being experienced by different residents and visitors. Housing has effectively been commodified, certainly across most of Europe and large parts of the rest of the world, and increasing numbers of destinations are regulating and taxing short-term lets. Demarketing can work. I've already mentioned Amsterdam, been very successful in that. The retail offer can be regulated through the planning system and what uses are available for shop spaces or retail spaces in different parts of a city. And transport routes can be altered and marketed. So there's a famous case in Barcelona where the city authorities got Google Maps to take a particular bus route off Google Maps, stopped marketing it to tourists, and it was possible again for elderly people and living in that part of the city to get on a bus to come into town, and the tourists weren't finding it. So I said at the beginning, overtourism describes a feeling and a problem, and it's really important that you carefully analyse what the problem is if you're going to identify the causes and the remedies. And only when you've identified the causes and come up with remedies can you effectively intervene. I wanted just quickly at the end to say something about the Responsible Tourism Charter in 2022. It's a good place to start thinking about how tourism in Edinburgh could be made more responsible. The key thing to remember is that responsibility drives sustainability, and that really our objective with responsible tourism is to make better places for people to live in and better places for people to visit. Our world's diverse, and we need to explain why we take responsibilities for the things we choose to improve through tourism and the impacts of our efforts. Really important to be transparent about this, both with the guests and with the resident community. Greenhouse gas emissions, plastic waste and biodiversity are global issues. They need to be addressed everywhere. You need to set goals to minimise the negative economic, environmental and social impacts, including crowding and over-tourism. And you need to attempt to generate greater economic benefits for local people, enhance the well-being of host communities and provide better employment conditions, and a range of other things you can do to enhance the positive impacts of tourism. Critically, I think, to be successful, you need to involve local people in decision making. Barcelona has been particularly successful with that, and so has Kerala in the global south. It's about making a positive contribution to the conservation of natural and cultural heritage. It's about addressing biodiversity loss and being nature positive. And it's about providing inclusive employment for the differently abled and people of diverse ethnicities, gender and sexual orientation. And for guests, it's about providing more enjoyable experience through more meaningful connections and offering culturally sensitive experiences, engendering respect between tourists and hosts and building local pride and confidence. Tourism can make a big contribution to how people feel about a city. It's often a good feeling to be visited, but being over visited is not a good feeling. So the 2022 Charter ends with a call for action, recognising that sustainability is a journey and that transparent and auditable reporting on the impacts of our efforts is essential to demonstrate what is being achieved by those taking responsibility. Transparency, I think, is key. Thanks for listening.